comenzando este coloquio sobre filosofía, psicología y psicoanálisis. Tenemos la fortuna de tener al doctor Robert Pippin aquí, de la Universidad de Chicago. Vamos a operar de esta manera. Él nos va a dar su conferencia, después vamos a hablar de realmente el motivo de este coloquio, que es la presentación de la traducción en español de su libro Nietzsche, la psicología y la filosofía primera. Entonces, bueno, vamos a estar hablando un poco los presentadores de este libro, y al final de toda esta sesión abrimos preguntas para el público, participaciones, en fin. Pero bueno, muchas gracias por haber venido. Voy a presentar al doctor Robert Pippin. Él es experto en la tradición de filosofía alemana, concentrándose en Kant y Hegel. Ha publicado diversos textos sobre filosofía y psicología, filosofía política, teorías de la autoconciencia y el problema de la libertad. Su lista de libros es tremenda, ¿no? Para mencionar solo algunos, mencioné la teoría de la forma de Kant, por supuesto, Nietzsche, la psicología y la filosofía primera, también sobre el western americano, los westerns de Hollywood y el mito americano, y en fin, una larga lista de publicaciones. Él nos va a hablar precisamente de este libro, entonces le cedo la palabra ya sin más.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be in Mexico City again, and I'm especially grateful to Professor Briones for the translation of my book. You can't see the cover very well now, but if it is what I think it is, it's an extremely clever cover. It's a very close-up photograph of the eye of an animal. And to me, it looks like the eye of an owl, which means it's a reference to Hegel's famous claim about the owl of Minerva, the symbol of wisdom, which Hegel says takes flight only at dusk, when a historical period is over. But if the eye represents the eye of the owl of Minerva, what's extremely clever about the cover is that you see in the corner of the eye a fly, tiny fly, something dirty, impure, unclean, that disturbs the vision of the eye. It's a perfect cover for Nietzsche, and a challenge to the hyper-rationalist Hegel. So I'm very, very pleased with the cover, and of course very grateful to Pablo for the translation, and to all of you for being here, for allowing me to speak in my native language, although were I to try to speak your beautiful language, it would be very painful for you. I'm glad to come up with this solution. I have a little bit of a guilty conscience about this particular paper. In my book, I'm trying to argue that the main strands of the Nietzsche reception in philosophy have very badly distorted what Nietzsche was trying to do. One strand is the Anglo-American attempt to turn Nietzsche into a conventional philosopher, so that we hear his views on epistemology, metaphysics, value theory, as if he were simply proposing assertions and offering unusual arguments for them. The other strand is the European reception, mostly influenced by Heidegger, which treats Nietzsche as the last metaphysician of the West, as a metaphysician of the will to power. That also seems to me to distort the uniqueness of Nietzsche in the philosophical tradition by associating him with more conventional treatments on either side of the divide in philosophy in the West that happened after Hegel. So in the book, I really pay a great deal of attention to the unusual literary style of Nietzsche, and I concentrate on three very famous images. One, the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, that truth is a woman, and that philosophers are very clumsy lovers. Secondly, first in the gay science, the very famous claim by Ayatollah Mensch, a crazy man, that God is dead, and that we have killed him. And third, from the genealogy of morals, the claim that just as there is no lightning behind the lightning flash, there is no subject behind a human deed. The doer is in the deed. Now, in the Anglophone reaction to my book, because the latter theme on the nature of a deed or an action makes so many connections with conventional philosophy of action, a lot of the responses to the book have been about that claim, more than about the general claim about Nietzsche or the other two parts. So this paper is a response to a few criticisms of that, the implications I draw from that claim. But the paper is going to make it sound like I think I am one of the people I'm criticizing. The conventional readers of Nietzsche offering a philosophical theory. I don't think Nietzsche offers a philosophical theory. I think Nietzsche's philosophy is not doctrinal. I think Plato's philosophy is not doctrinal. It's about something else than substantive doctrine. But I needed to respond to these critics, and hence the form of this paper. In my 2011 book, Nietzsche, Psychology, First Philosophy, I argued for, among other things, the importance of the French moralists for any attempt to understand why Nietzsche should have said in Beyond Good and Evil that psychology now, that is because of him, because of Nietzsche, can once again become the queen of the sciences, and once more the path to the fundamental problem. Among other things, this led to a characterization of Nietzsche on human agency that could be called expressivist, and my intention in this paper is to clarify that in more detail. My purpose in invoking the tradition of Pascal, de Rochefoucauld, and above all Montaigne, aside from the fact of Nietzsche's frequent praise of that tradition and identification of himself with it has largely gone unnoticed, was twofold. First, this book is based on earlier lectures that were originally given in a cours du Collège de France in 2004. And anyone who knows anything about 20th century French philosophy, and especially French appropriations of Nietzsche, will know of the enormous influence of Heidegger on that tradition. My somewhat ironic intention was to remind my audience, my French audience, that from the point of view of Nietzsche, he is unquestionably better understood as a French moralist rather than the German metaphysician of Heidegger's influential lectures from the 1930s and the 1940s. But this historical association raises the philosophical question. Granted, one might concede, Nietzsche very greatly admired these people, especially Montaigne, and described what he was doing as psychology in a way that called into mind, but what does that tell us? What viewed in this way is a philosophically relevant psychology? This is a question the book tries to answer from a number of different perspectives, but the core issue is the one that chiefly interested Nietzsche, the problem of self-knowledge, and the relation between that problem and knowledge of others' actions and words, and especially the unique kind of difficulty one faces in attempting to know such things as why one, or anyone, did what one did, what it actually was that one or anyone did, what one or some other truly values, why one values what one does, how one could come to know what sort of life one might truly affirm, and if so, how. It's clear everywhere in the text that Nietzsche did not think that this question could be answered by any manner of introspection, inner observation of any kind, anything like a natural science. And such self-knowledge is certainly not to be had by a priori philosophizing about the basic structure of the human soul, as in Plato's theory of the tripartite soul. It would at least be fair to say that the most prominent Nietzschean characterization of any claim to self and other knowledge is that it is extremely difficult to arrive at such knowledge, partly because it is neither empirical nor a priori knowledge in the conventional sense, partly because the soul is not an object in the usual sense, but mostly because in his treatments, such putative self and other knowledge is almost always an expression of some self-deception that must be overcome. This is not to say that there's no such thing as self or other knowledge properly understood, but to suggest that the truth in such a realm does not have as its opposite falsity in the propositional sense, but a kind of fraudulence, in what one reports about oneself or claims about another person. Understanding this, the moralists for Nietzsche offered observations on the sort of questions posed above, not by relying on a general theory that provided instances, but by finding ways to characterize how the human soul typically works in ways true to the unstable, variable, situation-dependent, self-interested context in which they arise. There is no way to summarize the method they use to do this because there is no such method, any more than there is any method that can be invoked to show how something like, quote, I knew not only that she was lying, but that she knew I knew she was lying, and she didn't care. We do know those things, and saying that we know them by inference from cues, say, gets us nowhere. One might as well ask what method Shakespeare, another of Nietzsche's heroes, used in coming to understand human beings like Macbeth or Othello or ambition or jealousy so well. Here is a summary of the dangers of a philosophical psychology that, I argued in the book, should be adopted as some sort of publication hurdle. That is, if I were king, no one could publish a book on Nietzsche unless they could argue it would be consistent with the remarks in assorted opinions and maxims from human all too human. Nietzsche is describing what he calls the, quote-unquote, original sin of all philosophers, who, he says, have always appropriated and ruined the views of the Menschenprüfer, the evaluators of the human, the moralists, because, quote, they have taken them for unqualified propositions and sought to demonstrate the absolute validity of what these moralists intended merely as approximate signposts, or even as no more than truths possessing tendency only for a decade, and through doing so to elevate themselves above the ladder. The example of such original sin he gives is Schopenhauer on the will. Nietzsche claims that Schopenhauer was in reality, without appreciating the fact himself, a moralist, who rightly used the term will loosely, and in a way that referred broadly to a meaning common to many different human situations, and as Nietzsche says, merely filled a gap in language. And so Schopenhauer had earned the right, quote, to speak of the will as Pascal had spoken of it. Unfortunately, though, quote, the philosophical rage for universality, unquote, turned such a moraliste façon de parler into a metaphysical claim about the omnipresence of the will in all of nature, a claim some, like Heidegger, have attributed to Nietzsche, but that Nietzsche calls a piece of mystical mischief, mystische Unfüge, and so ended up turning everything, Nietzsche says, into a false reification, to eine falsche Verdinglichung. Hence the general approach of the book. Now I come to the famous passage that's provoked a lot of criticism in my critics. It comes from Genealogy of Morals, section 1, passage 13, and here it is. To demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistances and triumphs, is just as absurd to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. A quantum of force is equivalent to a quantum of drive, will, effect, more. It is nothing other than precisely this very driving, willing, effecting, and only owing to the seduction of language and of the fundamental errors of reason that are petrified in it, which conceives and misconceives all effects as conditioned by something that causes effects, by a subject, that it can appear otherwise. For just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash, and takes the latter for an action, for the operation of a subject called lightning, so popular morality also separates strength from expressions of strength, as if there were a neutral substratum behind the strong man which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. Das Tun ist alles. Unquote. The passage is highly literary, enigmatic, and not at all systematic. However fascinating, it does not give us a lot to work with, and much of the interpretive task consists in determining what Nietzsche could have meant, given what else he says about psychological explanation. The idea that Nietzsche is indirectly proposing here, that the doer is expressed in the deed, and in that sense is not behind it as a separate cause, opens the door to very large issues prominent in Spinoza on a substance's non-temporal expression in its attributes and modes, and similar issues in everyone from Leibniz to Schelling to Jacob Böhme, as Deleuze has argued. But more directly, and from the outset, one might entertain immediate doubts that, to explain the passage, we have to commit Nietzsche to that different relation between doer and deed than an ex-ante causal origin, with the deed as a result. Why not, as the passage seems to suggest, that there's no relation at all between a doer and a deed because there is no doer? Admittedly, the most startling formulation in this passage is an analogy. Just as there is no lightning behind and causing as a result the flash, as might be suggested by the sentence, the lightning flashed, so there is no doer behind the deed, as might be suggested by John hit the ball. Such a substratum is a fiction added on. The deed is all there is, everything, always. As if we should really say, I suppose, there are just ball-hitting events going on. As noted, I argue that this passage should be understood differently as a sketch of an expressivist theory of action one can find throughout Nietzsche. That is, that he remains committed to the distinction between action and event, and is proposing a way to make the distinction different from voluntarism, spontaneity theories, intention causal theories, and so forth. That difference involves noticing that Nietzsche is only denying that there is a doer behind and separate from the deed. The language of doer-deed is not dropped. A strong person's strength is expressed in a desire to overcome in other things. In a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistances and triumphs. The various bodily movements involved in each of these activities would be unintelligible. Mere bodily movements in space and time, were we not able to understand them in their psychological meaning as expressions of strength, as motivated by a strength that wants expressing. If deeds are reduced to mere bodily movements like natural events, we won't have any way of distinguishing identical body movements that are directly motivated and so are different deeds. There would be many such problems. Excuse me. However, the no substratum, nothing behind the deed language, prohibits us from thinking of psychological motives or even their neurobiological counterparts as causes of separate deeds. And we must keep this in mind when Nietzsche gives his own psychological explanations, and I wouldn't know how to characterize those explanations except as psychological, the famous ones of pity, of humility, of the desire for equality, for the slave revolt in morality, and so forth. These are not just events that happen, they are psychologically motivated. But then we need to explain what he means by saying there's no doer behind the deed, but in the deed. That's my suggestion that Nietzsche is trying to get us to see the doer in the deed rather than behind it. And the point of that is to deflate our reliance on our own ex-ante formulations of intention to account for what happens. Such formulations, when necessary, again, there wouldn't be deeds unless such mindedness could be attended to as such, are only provisional, are realized or not only in the deed that reveals what in fact we are committed to doing, what we really intended. Nietzsche does not go any further in the passage or elsewhere, so as noted, the task in filling out such a view in a way consistent with other things Nietzsche says, like the Schopenhauer moralist passage just quoted, or his own psychological explanations, is different. This is admittedly a complicated thought. It does not mean, as it might seem to, that in doing something, I discover some ex-ante determinate intention that caused the deed without my being aware of it. So the door is not open to a psychoanalytic explanation either. Nietzsche's insistence that the doer is wholly in the deed must mean that what I am willing to do, let us say, arises as the mindedness relevant to the deed as I actually act, and only then. Again, the model is something like an artist discovering what she wants only in the writing or painting. I have an example in the book that makes this point Nietzsche is making. There are, by most accounts, among educated Americans, 50 or 60% who consider themselves poets. Very large number of people. And they often imagine one of these people, to make this point about Nietzsche, having an idea for a poem, and then trying to write what the person thinks is the intention behind the writing, and the poem is written, and the person realizes it's a bad poem. And so, say, she says to herself, well, that's not the true expression of what I intended. What I have in me is a good poem. I just haven't found the right mode of expression. The point I'm making in Nietzsche's name is, no, what you wrote is the bad poem that you had in mind. You're only able to write bad poems. You don't have a lot of good poems inside you that can't get out. So I'm saying Nietzsche is not denying that there's some provisional intention and some outward manifestation, but it's only in the outward manifestation that it can become clearer to you what you were committed to doing. So the premise governing all of this is that Nietzsche takes far, far more seriously than most philosophers that we are profoundly unknown to ourselves. Most of what we tell ourselves about our motivations, commitments, intentions, is very likely false. And we only learn it's false if we learn it when we're called on to do something that turns out to be inconsistent with what we avow, pledge. I would never do that, we say, in criticizing someone else. And how often is it the case that when we face a similar situation, we do? There would be no films by Claude Chabrol, for example, if there were not such unknowingness in the minds of conventional characters. Now, I should say there's a perfectly ordinary sense in which we want to call the intention that explains what the deed is and why it was done simply what the agent had in mind to do, ex ante, before the fact. Nietzsche's not denying that. Sometimes this intention is implicit and unformulated, but it's easily available at any point if I am asked what I am doing and why. Why are you here, for example? Possible to give an answer that is some articulation of what you provisionally intended before you came. But again, in Nietzsche's world, it's very likely false, which we would only learn were you tested by having that intention require you to do something else that would establish, say, something more difficult. We can certainly imagine this mental state occurring sometime before the bodily movement begins, and so can say easily that such an intention and the agent who holds it can be understood as before and behind the deed that is eventually performed. Likewise, there's nothing in what Nietzsche is suggesting to imply that there are not conditions that have to be met for the deed to qualify as mine alone. I have to be able to exercise some control over the event, not be coerced or duped and manipulated. I see no Nietzschean reason to deny that persons can come to understand themselves this way and can attempt to live out the implications of a self-image. It's the correct analysis of this way of speaking that's at issue. So Nietzsche's account need not deny that there are such ex ante, before the fact, formulations, as if they couldn't exist. His model just holds them to be provisional, most often in ordinary doings, perhaps very simple doings, actually and unproblematically manifested in the deed, but it's only there. that the provisional becomes actual. They are realized, made real in what we are willing to do. And they need to be considered provisional because in a surprisingly large number of significant cases, what we are willing to avow as our intention is a fantasy, largely self-deluded and not consistent with what we do. In the passage, in other words, Nietzsche still refers to deeds, doings, and not events, things that happen. And with that, as far as I can see, the question of how and why the deed was produced, and with that, the problem of the doer, is unavoidably raised. So I presume that everyone would agree that Nietzsche shows no tendency to treat a plant's phototropism, or iron ore rusting, as explicable in the same way as human activities. There is perhaps some analogous or metaphorical way to say that the plant turning toward the sun expresses its need for light, but there is nothing in that that refers to the plant's view of what it needs and why, nothing psychological. As indicated in the examples, Nietzsche's explanation of such things as the slave revolt, pity, humility, egalitarianism, a reference to the mindedness inherent in such activities, is essential to their individuation and explanation. If we simply try to do justice to the fact that Nietzsche's explanation of such phenomena are everywhere psychological, an attempt to determine what mindedness is really expressed in the deed, the issue of how he understands the relation between the deed's mindedness and the deed is unavoidable. He rejects behind and before, and I suggested he is thinking of in, and as a process of realization. Things get complicated quickly because Nietzsche is so suspicious of the avowed self-ascribed motivations provided by agents, but he always suggests as what truly motivates other psychological phenomena like ressentiment or fear or self-hatred. And although in this passage Nietzsche suggests that strength cannot but express itself as strength, that claim must be made consistent with the variety of things he says about such dispositions. There is the issue of what counts as the expression of strength. Much easier to say in the case of birds of prey than human expressions. For example, what Nietzsche calls the ascetic, life-denying ascetic, might regard his activities, refraining from expressions of strength, as the highest manifestation of strength. Then there are contexts in which strength is not allowed its expression, and the strong, to use his words, can be said to rub themselves raw on the bars of self-imposed cages. There is strength that can be said to turn against itself as strength. Distinguishing any of these will require the depth psychology Nietzsche is proposing. Still, one might say, while agreeing that Nietzsche does not tie any notion of individual responsibility to a spontaneous causal power to initiate bodily movements, any continuing to talk of a doer, even in the deed, betrays a lingering reluctance to break more completely with the essentially moral notions of individual responsibility, agent, and accountability, a truly revolutionary break many suspect may be the sort Nietzsche intended. But it's not clear where such a radical break would land us. I made use of Nietzsche's invocation of Spinoza to show why for him agent regret, people feeling bad that they did something, that it was on them that they did it, their fault. Nietzsche preserves such agent regret, but it's not regret that I could have done otherwise, but sadness that I turned out not to be other than I had imagined. Just a suggestion requires more filling out, but any such exposition must be consistent with the fact that first, Nietzsche does want some account of agent regret. That's why he turned to Spinoza, from whom he gets this understanding of sadness. And second, so the idea here is you did something you were ashamed of. You lied to a friend to achieve a benefit for yourself. And you feel a great regret that you did that later. And the regret is, I shouldn't normally express, I shouldn't have done that. I could have avoided doing that. The Spinoza-Nietzsche analysis is, no, you couldn't have avoided doing it. That's who you are. What you feel is sadness, that you turned out to be the kind of person who would lie to a friend for self-benefit. And secondly, all of Nietzsche's rhetoric, as you all know, is everywhere hortatory and condemnatory. In some sense or other, he expects, or at least hopes, that we can overcome nihilism largely by listening to, being gripped by him, a transformation that may produce what we are now not, what he calls sovereign individuals. All these notions continue and deepen the question of the right understanding between an agent and her deeds. It does not avoid or dismiss the question as if there is no such distinction. At this point, there are several things to say about the expressivist. The deed expresses the doer in the deed. Let us say of inner and outer. And first of all, failed actions. These are the sorts of cases that are often raised as objections to me and to Nietzsche. So if what you are is only fully expressed in the deed, what about deeds that really, because of contingencies, don't have any real connection with anything ex ante? Someone, let's call him Lanier, did everything he could to arrive on time for Joshua's party, but some intervening contingency prevented him, traffic, for example. But surely he intended to arrive on time. Must an expressivist account say otherwise? Since he arrived late, he must have been intending to arrive late? No. Lanier took several outer steps towards the outer realization of his intention. He left early, checked the traffic, drove moderately so he wouldn't get in a wreck. There's plenty of evidence from other actions that he's always polite and conscientious about such things, and that he values Joshua's friendship. And there is no way he could have gotten himself stuck in the traffic jam. That happened to him. He was well on the way, and there's plenty of outer manifesting his inner, even if not completely. Now notice that the situation would change if we imagine Lanier's wife saying, "Why do you always drive this way to go to Joshua's? You know it always makes us late, and you know there's a better way." That would change everything. Or if we imagine Lanier at home saying, "There's plenty of time to get there, but I always have bad luck with traffic, so I might as well not even go, since I'll arrive so late. But at least I intended to go, until I remembered this." No, you didn't intend to go. Moreover, the fact that the doer must be understood to express in the deed need not entail that everything in the agent's ex ante mindedness must be expressed for the movement to count as a deed, that the doer is wholly identified with the deed in that sense. There can be degrees of expression that can be authentic expressions, or that expression alone warrants the agent's affirmation of the deed, just if it's even a partial. On the former issue, the position I want to attribute to Nietzsche is not wholly indifferent to contingencies. So take my poetry example and consider the case of sculpture. I begin to sculpt, and a small, insignificant chisel mark cracks the entire stone into pieces. One should not say that I must have intended this pile of rubble, that I must be identified with what happens. That is the key. Something happened. Something that was not a deed. Could have been an expression of any aspect of my mindedness. Again, the situation changes if we imagine someone warning our sculpture, "You know, you take too many risks always chiseling like that. So many of your marbles crack. You seem to want them to crack." So, on my account, the relation between doer and deed is some form of identity. Something can count as a deed, even if not the deed I self-deceptively and self-servingly insisted is. The deed could be mine, even if a lot remains undetermined for me and others about what I actually intended by doing it. It could be very unclear. We might have to wait and see what else I am willing to do in order to be more determinative. There can be a great deal of interpretive play and so indeterminacy for me and others in the question, what is it that I have done and why? There can be a lot of imprecision in trying to draw a line between what happens because of me, but is not something I did, and what I did. On the latter issue, the expression-affirmation issue, there are clearly two senses at work of the deed being mine. The first might be called a merely forensic sense, an answer to the question, whose deed is this? This deed was brought about, but by whom? This is the sense in which the law wants to know whose deed, whose murder. The butlers, the mistresses, who killed Colonel Mustard in the dining room. Then there's another sense, much more difficult to answer, and this turns on the very elusive issue of the Nietzschean theory of freedom. Nietzsche was obviously concerned that the power of modern conformism would render any expression of anyone's mindedness some sort of distortion, and so some sort of social pathology, even if authentic. But a distortion, no, anyway, the idea here is that even if your deed does reflect perfectly some avowed intention that you begin with, the forces that led to the formation of this intention in you are so external to you and manipulate you to such an extent for the sake of someone else that even though you act freely, in the sense that no one coerces you to act that way, you feel no imminent threat. Because of the formation of the intention in a situation of such conformism, the deed can still not count as yours. But a distortion of what? Of what the agent would have intended had she not been subject to these conforming powers? Would have intended, if we imagine her free from the very beginning to be whoever she wants to be? That's clearly an idle fantasy for Nietzsche. No one could be in any such position. His own sense of genuinely or authentically mine is extremely difficult, and it is a long-standing problem in the history of philosophy. From the happy slaves issue to Rousseau and Kant, happy slaves meaning, suppose it's literally true that household slaves in the American South, when offered the chance to be free, chose to stay in the house as slaves. If you have a very limited conception of freedom, you would think, well, that settles the issue. They chose it. If you have a more complicated sense of what the conditions of choice are, you might not believe that. And I don't think that some notion of one struggling to overcome some obstacle in the outer will get us very far. That I'm struggling, striving, so it shows that I'm acting authentically. People can struggle very hard to express a canned and wholly inherited and manipulated sense of themselves. A few moments observing American politics can make that point. I think that all the evidence is that Nietzsche thought he knew how to make this distinction between mind in the merely forensic or factual sense, where that means simply not someone else's, and truly mine, all without having a true self ontology. But it did not make it easy for commentators, given what he said, to state the nature of this distinction, so there's still much to be done. Here's another component any psychological reading of Nietzsche must face. Bernard Williams praised Nietzsche's, as he called it, minimalist psychology. He was aligning himself with what he took to be Nietzsche's suspicions of accounts of the human soul that were already committed to some moral or ethical ideal, and then postulated the faculties or capacities necessary to make the pursuit of such ideals look possible and coherent. The divided, all the images in the history of philosophy, the divided soul, the free will, conscience, a moral sense, would all be examples of such a mistake. The relation, Nietzsche and Williams in effect argued, should go the other way. If we wanted to explain the possibility and coherence of the pursuit of such ideals, we ought to be constrained in doing so by an account of the capacities and faculties available in non-moral actions. Having introduced that notion, my aim was to associate it in its generality with the kinds of things the Platonic Socrates invokes eros, desire, to account for, from art to philosophy to love of good laws to friendship. The idea in such generality was first to notice the signal importance of what Nietzsche called esteeming, schätzen, valuing. Nietzsche considers asserting a claim or recommending an action as expressions of some commitment to a value, something like promises to keep faith with and to be able to justify what was claimed, to remain committed to the implication of what was recommending. For Nietzsche, famously, these values are values because they are valued, not in themselves. although that intimation of a projection of value misleadingly suggests individual acts of projection that punctuated moments of time conferring value. That's not the case. The claim is there would not be such values were humans not to have come to value them. But that process is complicated, collective, sustained over time, mediated in many institutional, religious, and artistic practices, and inherited. Very rarely, except in moments of crisis, open to revision. Nietzsche thinks we are living through such a potentially revolutionary time, comparable to the end of the tragic age of the Greeks. I went on to try to distinguish mere everyday commitments to various values, which are frequently subject to revision, expansion, abandonment, and by contrast, depth commitments, the loss of which would leave us nearly literally lost, disoriented, so they're almost impossible to imagine giving up. In undertaking these depth commitments, we are not fulfilling some other commitment, as if there could be a universal obligation to undertake depth commitments. That would obviously start an infinite regress. But there must be in our lives a hierarchical relation between thin, everyday, abandonable, and depth commitments. In making a claim or recommending an action, we commit ourselves to a variety of obligations that cannot all be fulfilled, and we need some orienting concern, some general sense of what is more or less important if we are to resolve these conflicts. We might say that the issue concerns what matters to us, which things matter because others do, and things that simply matter, that we cannot imagine not mattering. Now the interesting point. Since we do not and cannot decide what ought to matter, and thereby have it matter, even though we can do what we think ought to be significant to do, even without it actually mattering to us more than that. And as we all know, some things can matter to us that we are embarrassed about, that we think ought not to matter. We have to call such commitments, I think, what matters, pre-reflective and pre-volitional, or in another way, erotic attachments. We do not, for example, decide whom or what to love, whom or what to care about. It would be a very, there are people who walk around and dating services now do this, in which you interact with your fellow human beings on the basis of a list of desirable qualities. And when you find somebody that fits the list, you might be able to convince yourself that you now, since they fit the list, love the person. That, of course, will be absurd. In our actions and say it doesn't happen very often. In our actions and inactions, we can be said to express what matters and what does not, and in our actions more reliably than what we avow. And in certain rare crisis moments, a depth commitment can be at stake, and the extent of such depth can be revealed. Now, this doesn't commit Nietzsche to any inner self. He's a well-known critic of that notion, as if you have a kind of core identity. For one thing, there's no assumption about such underlying permanent commitments or the bearers of such commitments. Things come to matter to someone in this critical way, and they can cease to matter suddenly, or matter in a different sense. The qualitative difference in the degree of the importance of a commitment and the role of that commitment in ordering one's actions need not entail any inner self ontology. Some critical deed may be critical because what is at stake is what matters the most, but only at that time, in that context. The spatial relation at issue is actually not rightly captured by notions like underlying or deep, but rather highest, and is in highest values. Now, I argued in the book that it was important to see things this way in order to understand that Nietzsche's diagnosis of our own time, the time of nihilism, was that it was not a crisis of credible belief, or contrary to the common interpretations of Nietzsche of strength of will, but the failure of desire, the failure of mattering. This immediately gives the impression that the signal manifestation of this problem is failure in the sense of collapse, nothing mattering enough to be worth any investment or sacrifice. Boredom would be an example. This is, of course, a clear manifestation, And Nietzsche does appeal to the failure of desire in this sense with respect to the highest values. We don't care about anything highest. But there are lots of things that the people Nietzsche calls the last men, paradigmatic nihilists, care about. And they might even desire what they desire, however trivial, with passionate intensity. The even more paradoxical thought is that Nietzsche seems to think that one particularly catastrophic manifestation of nihilism in our age is contentment, bovine satisfaction in the low and base, caring about the wrong things, not caring. So clearly we need a more general sense of failure, more than just collapse or absence, if we are to understand nihilism as a failure of desire. We need something like certain pathological manifestations of desire, not its absence, can count as its failure, as in obsessive and so forever unsatisfiable desires, desires for unreasonable, unattainable objects, and an old standby in Nietzsche, self-deceived, self-destructive desires. One thought would be to pay attention to the fact that Nietzsche does not say that nihilism is the collapse of anything worth caring about, of all values. Nihilism is defined by the event the highest values devalue themselves. We might have lost the distinction between highest and most, might cease to care about it, to care only for what we happen to want. So the last men might care about all sorts of ends, but be without an ordering sense of the highest, that which matters most, worth sacrifice. And this disorientation is treated by Nietzsche as a kind of failure. They drift instead from pleasure to pleasure, timid, unwilling to take any risks for the sake of something worth taking risks for. This would count as a pathology if we can imagine such a life without begging any questions, as inevitably threatening some form of self-contempt, practical incoherence, conflicts that cannot be resolved, or is possible at all without these effects, only by massive self-deceit. We could point to these self-defeating effects as a defense against the charge that we are inventing a capacity for depth commitment in order to defend an ethical ideal, contra Williams minimalism. I don't suggest that it's obvious that Nietzsche thinks this, but I want to propose that this is the answer suggested by many of Nietzsche's formulations. So very briefly, a final issue for the expressivist psychological interpretation. It's hard to understand the frequent Nietzschean emphasis on the value of self-overcoming, which he virtually equates with his understanding of freedom. And such remarks as in the genealogy, every good thing on earth eventually overcomes, destroys itself. Or later in the genealogy, when Nietzsche proclaims what he calls the law of life, the law of the necessity of self-overcoming in the nature of life, and to do justice to the appearance of this constantly, beständig, in remarks like, quote, "How is freedom measured, in individuals as in nations? By the resistance which has to be overcome, by the effort it causes to stay afloat. One would have to seek the highest type of free man where the greatest resistance is constantly being overcome." Unquote. Does this emphasis in Nietzsche's praise of self-overcoming skew the interpretation in favor of some sort of priority of self-dissatisfaction, as if only such endlessly unsatisfied individuals were worthy of Nietzsche's praise? This is also a familiar idea in the modern tradition. Among the German Romantics in the beginning of the 19th century, especially in Friedrich von Schlegel, there arose the idea that irony is not merely a literary trope, a literary style, but an attitude to take with respect to the most important issues. That the fundamental style of one's life should be ironic, committed and not committed at the same time. I think we all know people like that. Here I have to quote myself as a response to this, a summary of what the self-overcoming passages show. One initial, still quite crude summary of what he's getting at in these passages would simply be that achieved freedom involves achieving a capacity both to sustain a wholehearted commitment to an ideal and what appears at first glance to be a capacity in some tension with such wholeheartedness, a willingness to overcome or abandon such a commitment in altered circumstances or as a result of some development. to be unable to endure the irresolvable dynamic of what Nietzsche calls an ideals or a goals or a values constant self-overcoming, to remain dogmatically attached to an already overcome form of life, all these are treated as forms of unfreedom. Secondly, it is a consequence of this expressivism that it counts what should be and is treated as, by Nietzsche, a rare and very difficult achievement, seeing oneself expressed in one's deeds in a wholehearted affirmation as a normal, everyday occurrence. Is that what I'm saying? No. As emphasized before, there are two separate questions that must be kept distinct. Expressivism is a claim that shares an assumption with all accounts of action as such, that there are bodily movements or mental happenings that stand in relation to a subject's mindedness. And it argues for a kind of relation different from all causal, compatibilist, voluntarist, free will accounts. Then there are all sorts of further questions one can ask about such expressed mindedness, including whether the deed actually or fully expresses what the agent avows, and whether the agent's mindedness can be said to really reflect her, or itself is the product of a coercive conformism. So to jump to another point, the people Nietzsche calls the weak types can certainly be said to express themselves and say they're vengeful, moralistic acts of punishment or revenge. But what they avow as their intention is self-deceived, and it's usually a moralistic expression. And because of that, they can be said to be engaged in the self-defeating pattern evaluations. Their acts express a motivation, really express a motivation that they disavow, even to themselves, holding together the deception and the psychic satisfaction from realizing their real intentions more and more difficult. Or without self-deception, one could say, this is an example for all of the highly educated graduate students in philosophy who end up not being able to find a job other than in the kind of teaching institution I'm about to cite. So I could say, teaching that course 4 times a week on ethics for bureaucrats is what I did. It's my deed. My intention to teach the course is real. It's expressed in what I do. My preparation, my showing up on time, they all express my intention to do a good job. But this job I found at East Podunk Technical Teachers College is the only one I could find after Princeton. And the activity is not an expression of my highest values, or what I would have chosen, or what I believe ought to be taught. I can be said to see some aspect of myself in the deeds, say, my willingness to do whatever it takes to keep teaching some sort of philosophy. But certainly not the self I would wholeheartedly affirm. Nothing I attribute to Nietzsche is inconsistent with such a characterization, and so I conclude that the account of expressivism I attribute to him is not subject to the kinds of criticisms I've been hearing, like the ones I expressed today and tried to answer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vamos a hablar 4 de nosotros sobre el libro, que aquí va un pequeño anuncio. La edición ya está por problemas técnicos, no está aquí vendiéndose en este mismo momento, pero vamos a hacer una lista. Vamos a hacer una lista para aquellos de ustedes que quieran tener el libro. Los apuntamos y en unos días, una semana máximo, ya pueden tener el libro. Bueno, otro anuncio muy rápidamente es que el doctor Pippin va a estar mañana en la UNAM, en el Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, hablando de la teoría de la forma de Kant. Entonces aquí está representando al Instituto Marcelo, le damos las gracias. Mañana, para el que quiera, también va a ser una charla muy interesante. Bueno, y sin más, yo les ruego a mis colegas hablar 10-15 minutos para que nos dé tiempo. Y adelante, doctora María Pía. Muchas gracias.
Muy rápidamente agradecer primero a Carlos Mendiola, a Solís y a Pablo Lazo el haberme invitado aquí hoy. Mi reseña reseña es larga, pero como lo ha dicho muy bien Pablo, yo la sinteticé lo más que pude. ¿Se oye mejor? Bueno, mi reseña la sinteticé. Ahora coincide con la presentación que hizo el Dr. Pippin. Quiero decir que yo tengo otras partes en las que hablo de otros temas, pero básicamente me voy a concentrar en su teoría de la acción expresiva en la interpretación que él hace de Nietzsche. Así está, lo primero que quiero decir es que esta lectura que hace el Dr. Pippin del libro no solo está inspirada en una especie de tesitura de tipo wittgensteiniano, particularmente por la conexión de la voluntad con el deseo, y me refiero particularmente a los aforismos del Tractatus 6.423, 6.521, donde Wittgenstein asume que lo que es importante de los valores está en la psicología. Sino que también lo que me parece a mí interesante del tema de esta interpretación es que nos ofrece una teoría de la acción que ha permanecido casi ignorada en anteriores intentos por comprender su trabajo. Pippin nos reclama que pensemos en un Nietzsche más wittgensteiniano, porque este vio que la psicología estaba ligada a la moral, precisamente porque ambas parten de la tematización de la voluntad. Pippin recuperará la dimensión filosófica de un Nietzsche post-metafísico, pero no desligado de la herencia de ciertos moralistas franceses. Y para documentar esta postura, habrá que comenzar a cuestionar lo que hay debajo de las conexiones entre ciertas metáforas y tropos, que son las que precisamente quedaron ocultas tras los conceptos y las categorías que han hecho célebre a Nietzsche. La gran aportación de Nietzsche con su teoría del poder, la conexión histórica con el método de la genealogía y el tema del cuestionamiento de los valores, tienen que ser ahora complementados con una teoría de la acción expresiva que Pippin liga a la teoría nietzscheana de la psicología. Y ya que los compromisos normativos que poseemos están sujetos a cambios históricos, la psicología misma no puede apartarse de las coordenadas de esta dimensión histórica, y por eso es necesario reconocer que si hablamos de algo así como la voluntad o el poder, estaríamos más bien refiriéndonos a un logro histórico, conceptual, material y social. Por lo tanto, el tema del poder no puede interpretarse simplemente como un impulso básico, externo o interno, sino como un proceso histórico que muchas veces se convierte en algo radicalmente distinto a lo que era originalmente. Pippin comienza entonces por desdibujar las interpretaciones que han ignorado esta dimensión en la obra nietzscheana, es decir, el cómo una teoría sobre el poder, que básicamente adquirió su significado como una lectura voluntarista del mismo, es más bien una interpretación anacronística que los estudiosos de Nietzsche han hecho, pasando por alto el antecedente que supuso el esfuerzo de Nietzsche por sentar las bases de la revolución wittgensteiniana, al menos en el sentido en el que he comentado sobre el Tractatus. La interpretación que hace Pippin recupera la forma ensayística, además, de la obra de Nietzsche, como una prueba de la conexión interna que existe con los moralistas franceses, tales como La Rochefoucauld, Pascal y muy especialmente Montaigne. Se trataría de planear cómo fue que Nietzsche quiso entender el permanente escepticismo de Montaigne frente a la fragilidad y los fracasos humanos, sin llegar a sumirse en la desesperación pascaliana y a su eventual y trágica capitulación. Por el contrario, Montaigne se mostró como alguien ferozmente honesto, alegre en espíritu y con la suficiente sabiduría como para sentirse cómodo en este mundo. Sich auf der Erde zu machen. Pero para poder comprender cómo logró Montaigne semejante proeza, Nietzsche tendrá que retomar el cuidado o la preocupación por el mundo, Sorge, en una vena erótica, el deseo carnal y material, el corazón, el eros, está tan comprometido con esta empresa de la acción que ya nada es posible sin la dimensión vital del deseo y de la seducción comprendidas en la voluntad. Así, Pippin termina afirmando que, cito textualmente, esta imagen brinda simultáneamente la prioridad del tema psicológico, la centralidad del eros en esta afirmación y la insuficiencia de la filosofía, así como la necesidad de escribir de forma diferente cuando uno ya se ha dado cuenta de que esta insuficiencia ha ocurrido. Está en la página 13 de la versión en inglés. Así, este es el modelo que se halla en la obra de Montaigne. Por eso la capacidad de comprender que la actitud negativa o el ascetismo es la única crítica que permite no temer a la transitoriedad de la vida y de encontrarse con la revancha del tiempo. Pues de lo que se trata es de retomar la famosa apuesta pascaliana. Ustedes conocen la famosa apuesta de decido pensar que existe Dios porque si no existe no me pasa nada, si sí existe estoy perfectamente bien. Pero ahora enfocada a la capacidad de mantener el deseo para posibilitar la acción, es decir, de poder situarse en la vida con deseo, aún sabiendo que es posible fallar, pues uno tiene que apostar por ella, aun cuando el fracaso es algo más que posible. Por lo tanto, Pippin insiste en que el tema de la voluntad y el de su funcionamiento serán tratados por Nietzsche como un tipo de gran proeza histórica del agente social. Esta teoría de la acción intentará hallar una combinación específica entre una alegría que se tamiza con la seriedad, en latín gravitas, es decir, con un tipo de pesimismo que es a la vez una fortaleza que permitiría soñar sin tener que dormirse. Ahí reside la gran tensión y el dilema del eros y de su permanente insatisfacción. Para Nietzsche, el instinto de libertad reside en la capacidad para resistir y en convertir a la voluntad del poder en la dimensión historizada de una crítica radical negativa. Para exorcizar ese fracaso es necesario entonces una teoría de la acción, pero la psicología de Nietzsche, como explicó ahora él, partirá de una forma muy diversa de comprender a la gente, pues son sus acciones lo que cuentan y no su justificación. Así llegamos al argumento central del libro con la afirmación de Nietzsche de que la acción es todo. El trabajo de Pippin entonces como intérprete será problematizar la necesidad de destruir las formas convencionales con las que tendemos a pensar en el agente de la acción ligado a sus antecedentes, sus intenciones, sus creencias, sus valores, la disponibilidad del sujeto y su voluntad. Para Nietzsche, no hay ningún sustrato detrás de la acción. Esa idea es una ficción. Se trata entonces de una teoría de la acción expresiva contraria a toda teoría ligada a la causalidad intencional. El argumento crítico de Pippin es que Nietzsche no puede separarse tan fácilmente de la diádica relación entre el agente y la acción, pues aún en la noción de expresión se presupone una comprensión de cómo el autor puede encarnarse en su acto. Aquí ya nos explicó varias de estas cuestiones. Para Pippin, esta es la clave del problema nietzscheano. Dicha acción no es cualquier acción, sino la acción de un agente en particular. Y la dificultad estriba entonces en cómo comprender la relación entre el agente y su acción sin caer en causalismos. La respuesta de Nietzsche sería en que es posible comprender esta forma de acción si uno se remite a cómo la madre queda reencarnada en la figura del hijo, pero sabiendo que el hijo es independiente de ella una vez que ha nacido. Para Pippin, sin embargo, esta es la más problemática dimensión de Nietzsche, pues aún aceptando que es posible una teoría de la acción expresiva, existen otras dimensiones que hoy él tocó de la acción que no pueden ser soslayadas, tales como la idea de responsabilidad. Para Nietzsche, sin embargo, la inseparabilidad del agente de sus actos se expresa mejor en el ejemplo que él nos dio, que es la capacidad del poeta de producir un buen poema. Si erra en ello, no se trata del fracaso de sus intenciones, sino de lo que él puede hacer, porque es precisamente eso lo que lo define. La concepción nietzscheana de la inseparabilidad de la acción de la gente la retomó Hannah Arendt en su polémica obra Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. A pesar de que ha sido un libro muy mal comprendido, ella excluyó las intenciones de la gente, Eichmann, y se remitió a su incapacidad de calibrar sus acciones o a su falta de juicio. Sus actos fueron los que dieron el peso a la ley para poder establecer su culpabilidad y condenarlo. Arendt, mejor que nadie, comprendió esta versión expresiva de la acción nietzscheana, que tiene que complementarse con una teoría de la responsabilidad, y esa parece ser la diferencia entre Arendt y Nietzsche. Esta perspectiva no se le escapa a Pippin cuando cita en un pie de página la cuestión de cómo la responsabilidad legal ha resuelto el problema de la gente y de sus intenciones. Lo que importa no son las intenciones, sino la responsabilidad de las acciones. Esto en la página 81 del libro en inglés. Pippin explica que Nietzsche recurre a Spinoza para quien la contemplación de algo que ha ido mal solo puede permitir al actor exclamar algo así como esto no tuvo que haber ocurrido. Expresiones que curiosamente también se hallan en la obra de Arendt cuando trata estos temas. Es más bien la decepción y la tristeza las que reemplazan a la culpa en las teorías de la acción de Nietzsche. En la teoría de la acción de Nietzsche. El autoconocimiento para Nietzsche no puede ser observacional, sino interpretativo, es decir, lo que importa es cómo se describen acciones que ya han ocurrido, cómo se interpreta el sentido de estas como algo histórico, cambiante, falible. Cualquier ficción con la que intentemos justificar nuestras acciones será plausible solo a la luz de cómo esas acciones abrirán las posibilidades de un futuro y de adquirir con él su sentido. De esta forma, la cuestión de la acción tendrá que correlacionarse con una comunidad histórica y con sus juicios. De nuevo parece desprenderse de esta interpretación que hace Pippin de Nietzsche muchas similitudes con el proyecto de Arendt, aunque Pippin lo relaciona más con el de Hegel. La diferencia entre ambos autores, Nietzsche y Arendt, estriba en que mientras para Nietzsche dominar y empoderarse consiste en formas reinterpretativas que ganan tracción en el sentido de convertirse en significativas para la comunidad y abrir así el futuro. Mientras que para Arendt, esas significaciones históricas y contextuales de las acciones expresivas tendrán que poder convertirse en juicios reflexivos de la comunidad política sin la participación posterior del actor, pero con la posibilidad de cuestionar el juicio adecuado del mismo. Por eso, Arendt elige este camino apelando a la creatividad de los autores e historiadores que son los que recogen las acciones de otros agentes en relatos históricos o literarios. Sin embargo, Nietzsche se resiste a pensar de esta forma la acción porque incluye una clase de separación a posteriori entre el agente y su acción. En la interpretación de Pippin, este afirma que Nietzsche rehuye todas estas formas de considerar a la acción y lo que aparece en su lugar es esta gran tensión sobre la fragilidad de toda norma humana y la enorme gama de fracasos con la que nos enfrentamos. Es un proceso que contempla una dialéctica fuerte entre la afirmación de la voluntad del poder y su negación, algo así como el tener y no tener. Contrariamente a Arendt, para quien la comunidad fue determinante para juzgar e interpretar las acciones humanas, la versión concluyente de Pippin sobre Nietzsche se halla más cercana de la teoría de madurez de la última etapa de Foucault, para quien el poder, como el resistir, son expresiones de la libertad y ambas son empresas individuales autoafirmativas. Pero tal vez lo paradójico es que el logro de la gente requiere aquí de una clase especial de autorrelación intencional con los actos propios, lo cual comprende simultáneamente una actitud afirmativa tanto como su potencial de satisfacción. Se trata de un estado de extrema tensión y por eso Pippin afirma, contradiciendo a sus intérpretes habituales, que la voluntad de poder de Nietzsche tiene que ver menos con la noción de poder tradicional, pues se trataría más bien de ser indiferente a ese poder y lograr así sobreponerse a la radical autoconciencia del posible fracaso y con ello exorcizar a la inmovilidad. Gracias.
doctor Carlos Mendiola.
Bueno, le agradezco a Pablo que me haya invitado a escribir el prólogo con él, y yo voy a leer algo de lo que escribimos en el prólogo. Este pequeño libro, Nietzsche, la psicología y la filosofía primera, del cual presentamos su traducción al castellano, es pequeño en su extensión de páginas, pero no lo es en sus temas, argumentos y sutilezas empleadas para analizar el concepto de psicología filosófica en Friedrich Nietzsche. Robert Pippin asume el compromiso de explicarnos por qué Nietzsche propone reemplazar a la filosofía por la psicología. En particular, la psicología sustituirá a la metafísica, que era considerada la reina de las ciencias, aquella que planteaba los problemas fundamentales. En lo que sigue, trataré de exponer esta nueva disciplina, la psicología, y por qué su tarea es propuesta como fundamental para la filosofía sustituyendo a la metafísica. Cómo, según Pippin, el asumir esta posición, Nietzsche se coloca en la tradición de los moralistas franceses. Después mostraré que la propia propuesta de Pippin queda enmarcada por lo afirmado por la psicología. Y por último, que la exposición de Nietzsche y la de Pippin podría caracterizarse como una trampa cazabobos. La psicología debe tratar los valores que implica cualquier actividad. Dicho de otra forma, toda actividad implica un compromiso con ciertos valores y la psicología debe mostrarlos. Estos valores son colectivos, cambian de una clase social a otra y de una época a otra. Con creencias o normas compartidas se asume el compromiso de realizar un ideal porque se tiene la ilusión de que vale la pena seguirla hasta sus últimas consecuencias. Comprometerse con dicho valor significa tener una posición ante la vida. Por eso la psicología es prioritaria en tanto que trata los problemas fundamentales de la vida. La sutileza del análisis de Pippin consiste en mostrarnos que en medida que Nietzsche asume la tarea de sustituir la metafísica por la psicología, su propio quehacer está estructurado por este reemplazo. Mostrar por qué tendría que reemplazar la psicología a la metafísica es el quehacer de la filosofía, ahora psicología filosófica. Como el motivo de la sustitución no es otro que los valores de una época, la psicología tiene que mostrar los valores. En medida que la psicología debe mostrar estos valores, muestra la necesidad de la sustitución y la asume al mismo tiempo. Si podemos distinguir entre aquello que, cito la frase de Pippin, la psicología explicará y lo explicado básico, algo así como las imágenes creadas por los valores asumidos por una época y las condiciones que no pueden faltar cada vez que se hace psicología filosófica. Entonces, lo segundo lo encontramos en el quehacer de Nietzsche, cuando asume el compromiso de mostrar los problemas fundamentales, ya que estos problemas fundamentales tienen valor en el corazón de los intereses de Nietzsche. Estos problemas fundamentales no son producto de otra cosa que el compromiso asumido por él. En este caso, lleva a cabo un compromiso profundo, en tanto que el valor de los problemas tiene que ver con su propia vida. El compromiso profundo es aquel en donde se juega la vida. Tomar una posición u otra implica persistir en ella. En cambio, existen compromisos que se asumen por las circunstancias y en este caso fácilmente se abandona la posición que se había asumido. Estos compromisos de superficie son asumidos como cualquier otro participante sin que sea afectado por nada de lo que ocurre. En la sustitución de la metafísica por la psicología, el compromiso que asume Nietzsche implica que todas sus afirmaciones se sostienen en un compromiso vital. De acuerdo con la exposición de Pippin, el quehacer de la psicología filosófica de Nietzsche asume, lo coloca en la tradición de los moralistas franceses. Para Nietzsche, ellos hacen psicología en medida que se comprometen con valores que permitan vivir bien. Michel Montaigne, François La Rochefoucauld y Blaise Pascal son la tradición en la que se asume Nietzsche. Nos dice Pippin que de la Rochefoucauld aprende Nietzsche a ver el egoísmo de la compasión. De Pascal, como un alma noble es aplastada por el cristianismo. Y de Montaigne a ser un espíritu libre. Con él, con Montaigne, asume que nuestros compromisos profundos son con un valor y que no se pueden sustentar en una teoría. Solo adquieren sentido en el interés del corazón, la pasión o la vida. La sutileza del análisis de Pippin no solo se encuentra en mostrar cómo el quehacer de Nietzsche asume el interés del corazón, también el quehacer del propio Pippin queda enmarcado en ello. En medida que esto es una condición que hace auténtica la filosofía, psicología filosófica, Pippin no puede excluirse de estas condiciones. Nos dice que en el prólogo para la edición en castellano, que señalar esta tradición de Nietzsche con los moralistas franceses es producto de haber asumido un compromiso, mostrar en el Colegio de Francia en 2004 que había olvidado las referencias explícitas del propio Nietzsche a estos filósofos. De manera equivocada, nos dice Pippin, la filosofía francesa del siglo XX asumió un compromiso con la metafísica heideggeriana, situando de manera equivocada el compromiso de Nietzsche con ella. Tampoco ellos, los filósofos franceses del siglo XX, se excluyeron de asumir compromisos. Lo asumieron con la metafísica y para Pippin es importante mostrarles que estaban equivocados. Por supuesto, tampoco Robert Pippin se excluye de tener que encontrar estos valores compartidos, puesto que él a su vez asume su compromiso con Bernard Williams, a cuya memoria dedica el libro, diciendo en el mismo prólogo para la edición en castellano que nadie que trate la psicología de Nietzsche puede ignorar lo que Williams llamó psicología minimalista. Otra vez aparecen los compromisos, en este caso Pippin lo dice de la siguiente manera, cito: él, Williams, se alineó con lo que consideró ser la sospecha de Nietzsche frente a las explicaciones del alma humana. Nietzsche, que aquellos que pretendían explicar el alma humana estaban comprometidos con algún ideal moral o ético y por tanto postulaban las facultades o capacidades necesarias para hacer ver como imposible e incoherente la persecución de tales ideales. Hasta ahí la cita. Lo que Pippin llama alinearse significa que Williams también asume un compromiso, esta vez con la hermenéutica del buen recreo, ya que hace referencia a su frase hermenéutica de la sospecha. De acuerdo con la cita anterior, Williams nos dice que Nietzsche dirigió la sospecha a qué hace que cuando la filosofía trata de explicar el alma humana multiplique facultades morales como voluntad, libre, conciencia, sentido moral. Y bajo esta sospecha, Nietzsche se pregunta, ¿esta multiplicación de facultades no es producto de la necesidad de mantener la culpa? En todo caso, si la pregunta en cambio se dirige por cómo alcanzamos nuestros ideales, entonces debemos limitarnos a una economía de las facultades en relación con cualquier acción sin presuponer la culpa. Y como hemos visto, la respuesta implicaría que si buscamos cualquier ideal es porque asumimos compromisos. Y nos dice Pippin, Nietzsche considera afirmar una tesis o recomendar una acción como expresión de algún compromiso con un valor, algo así como las promesas para mantener la fe por lo que se defiende y ser capaz de justificarlo, permanecer comprometido con las implicaciones de lo que a uno se le está recomendando. Por tanto, la tesis es muy general, radica en sostener que el dominio de la inteligibilidad intencional misma es el dominio del valor, la autosubsunción bajo normas. Hasta ahí. Pero no podríamos hablar de una voluntad libre e independiente de las acciones. En síntesis, actuamos, buscamos ideales porque asumimos compromisos y estos compromisos tienen dos formas de asumirse, de manera superficial y profunda. Y Robert Pippin nos dice que de esta manera se lleva a cabo la psicología filosófica, asumiendo compromisos. En tanto que no hay nada más, existe un riesgo, el nihilismo, el cual consiste en que uno no puede estar convencido de que debe tener una ilusión. El nihilismo aparece como una serie de creencias que ponen en duda la importancia de comprometerse con un valor. Asumirlo significa no poder identificarse con nuestros compromisos, como si esta fuera la razón para proponer la sustitución de la psicología por la metafísica. Lo importante es que detrás de las afirmaciones esté un compromiso por la vida. En relación con la necesidad de sustituir la metafísica por un discurso que hable de preguntas fundamentales, Pippin refiere la expresión que utilizó Williams para caracterizar la manera en que hacía filosofía Nietzsche: una trampa cazabobos. El compromiso de Nietzsche era evitar hacer teorías filosóficas, lo que podríamos entender como metafísica, pero no por eso sostenía que había que dejar de hacer filosofía. Por el contrario, dejar de hacer filosofía sería aceptar el nihilismo. Por eso, de acuerdo a Williams, cuando Nietzsche deja de hacer teorías filosóficas, metafísica, sigue haciendo filosofía plagada de trampas cazabobos. Pippin sugiere que podríamos entender por estas trampas cazabobos algo así como sustraer con una mano lo que parece haber dado la otra. Con estas trampas se sigue haciendo filosofía, según Nietzsche, psicología filosófica, y de esta manera resistiendo a hacer teoría. Podremos decir que el libro de Pippin asume que lo importante es preguntarse qué significa la resistencia a la teoría. Y según él, Nietzsche resiste a la teoría porque está comprometido con algo más. No deja de escribir libros porque piensa que hay algo importante que compartir. Por último, creo que el libro del cual presentamos su traducción al castellano está plagada de trampas cazabobos, que nos muestran el propósito de hacer un análisis del concepto de psicología, comprometiéndose con una forma de hacer filosofía que no es otra cosa que la resistencia a la teoría. Esta trampa cazabobos consiste en aparentar hablar de la filosofía de Nietzsche, cuando lo que está detrás es asumir compromisos acerca de por qué podría resultar valioso hablar de ello. En breve, el libro está escrito con todo lo que supone estar encontrando en la filosofía de Nietzsche. Gracias.